And we have to admit it, because we are influenced by our environment, and the environment he came from, albeit from a Catholic and Protestant point of view, is whoever the enemy is, we have to kill the enemy. The enemy at that particular time happened to be black, but it equally could have been English, and he would have wanted to kill any Englishman. So, but those holier than thou who says how terrible it is, it's a disgrace.
He called him a racist. John Barnes just named 5 players he will never forgive. Mark Viduka refused to come back onto the pitch. Glenn Hoddle built a career on selfishness. Teammates laughed as bananas were thrown. The media turned calm into careless, and the boardrooms kept their doors locked. This is not about grudges. This is about betrayal. Most footballers remember the fans who hurt them. Barnes does not. He forgave the working-class racist on the terrace because he understood their conditioning. But he cannot forgive the men who stood beside him in the dressing room and said nothing. The ones who knew better. The ones who had power. The ones who chose silence. Barnes played in an era when acknowledging racism meant breaking rank. It meant being soft or political. His teammates would see the bananas thrown at Goodison Park in 1988 and call it banter. They would pat him on the shoulder and say the crowd was not booing him, but the player. As if Barnes did not know the difference, as if his race did not define the abuse. This silence was not ignorance, it was maintenance. By refusing to name the problem, his teammates made Barnes the problem. They let him carry the burden alone whilst they preserved their comfort. Barnes has said if a team walked off the pitch back then, they would be out of work. But the offer was never made. Not by Dalglish, not by Rush, not by Hansen. They left him to face it in isolation. That is what he cannot forgive. The banana incident is famous because Barnes backheeled the fruit away, but the real story happened afterwards in the dressing room. Some teammates laughed. Others made jokes. Most ignored it completely. They treated the racism as part of the game, something to endure rather than confront. For Barnes, this was deeper than the abuse from strangers. The fans acted on societal conditioning. His teammates knew him, trained with him, supposedly respected him. Yet they prioritized group comfort over his safety. The unspoken contract of the dressing room is solidarity. His peers broke it. Barnes describes this as teammates using racial slurs disguised as humour. If he objected, they accused him of having a chip on his shoulder. This gaslighting is unforgivable. It denied him the right to define his own trauma. Barnes has defended Peter Beardsley against claims of malicious racism, calling him ignorant rather than hateful. But ignorance is not an excuse for those who witnessed the abuse and stayed silent. The culture was governed by hypermasculinity where vulnerability was taboo. For a white player to say racism was unacceptable would mean breaking rank. So they did not. They let Barnes absorb it. The invisible banana skins, as Barnes calls them, are worse than the visible ones. The modern game takes the knee, but where were these men when it mattered? The defining moment of Barnes's managerial career came at Celtic in 2000. It was supposed to be a seminal moment for black managers in Britain. Barnes arrived alongside Kenny Dalglish as a dream ticket, but the dressing room turned toxic fast. Mark Viduka, the star striker, became the face of a mutiny that ended Barnes's career at the top level. During the Scottish Cup match against Inverness Caledonian Thistle, Celtic were losing at home. At half-time, tensions boiled over. Viduka reportedly refused to play the second half. This was not a tantrum, it was insubordination, a direct challenge to Barnes's authority. Barnes had no choice but to substitute his top scorer for Ian Wright. Celtic lost 3-1. The media frenzy was immediate. 2 days later, Barnes was sacked. Meanwhile, Viduka was sold to Leeds United for profit and enjoyed a successful Premier League career. Barnes never got another Premier League job. Viduka's refusal was not just about football. Barnes believes it was a test of boundaries, accelerated by unconscious bias about black leadership. Would a white manager with Barnes's playing pedigree have been treated with such open contempt? Barnes had won 2 Footballer of the Year awards, 2 league titles with Liverpool, and 79 England caps. Yet Viduka felt empowered to refuse his instructions. This was racism through the refusal to accept black authority. But Viduka was not alone. Senior players like Alan Stubbs were part of a clique that undermined the new regime. There were reports of friction over training methods and scepticism towards Barnes's tactical approach. In a functional dressing room, senior players police rebellions. At Celtic, the silence of the leaders was a tacit endorsement of the mutiny. Barnes was left isolated, not just by Viduka, but by the collective failure of the squad to respect his office. The aftermath exposed the invisible banana skins Barnes speaks about. Whilst Barnes was cast into the managerial wilderness for nearly a decade, Viduka thrived. He secured a lucrative move and became a Premier League success. Barnes contrasts this with white managers who failed spectacularly but were immediately recycled into new jobs. Graham Souness and Brian Robson are examples. For black managers, failure confirms inherent unsuitability. For white managers, it is a rite of passage. This structural unforgiveness towards the football establishment is what Barnes directs his anger at. Viduka represents the insubordinate subordinate who refused to accept black authority. He is unforgiven. Glenn Hoddle and John Barnes should have been natural allies. Both were supreme technicians who operated with vision alien to English football's rigid physicality. But the media created a narrative that England could not accommodate two luxury players. One enigma was a risk, two was suicide. This pitted them in a zero-sum game for the creative soul of the team. Barnes resented the enigma label. His performances at Liverpool proved his tactical discipline and team ethic, qualities he felt Hoddle lacked in favour of individualistic brilliance. The friction intensified when Hoddle became England manager from 1996 to 1999. His management style was characterised by philosophical arrogance, a belief in his own tactical superiority, and notoriously a reliance on faith healers and karma. Barnes critiqued Hoddle's management as symbolic of the London Spurs ethos, individualistic and flashy. This stood in contrast to the Liverpool ethos of collective responsibility and humility. Barnes has suggested that a British genius, strongly implied to be Hoddle, could never have played for Liverpool because their character would not submit to the collective. This is a profound accusation. Barnes is calling Hoddle selfish, a player and manager who prioritised his own vision over the pragmatic needs of his players. Hoddle failed to unlock the potential of creative players when in management, often reverting to rigid structures that stifled the flair he once embodied. This philosophical betrayal is key to Barnes's grievances. Hoddle represented a footballing intellect that should have understood Barnes, but instead chose to marginalise him. Hoddle's controversial comments about disabled people paying for sins of a past life were evidence, to Barnes, of profound ignorance permeating the football establishment. If a manager can hold such warped views on disability and karma, it is unsurprising they harbour unconscious biases regarding race. Hoddle represents the intellectual gatekeeper, the figure who decides who is tactically astute and who is merely athletic. Barnes has spent his post-playing career fighting the stereotype that black players are athletes whilst white players are thinkers. He views Hoddle's management era as a period where this dichotomy was reinforced rather than challenged. Hoddle could never have played for Liverpool due to selfishness. That is Barnes's stance, and Hoddle is unforgiven. The media class constructed the John Barnes enigma. This was not neutral observation, it was racially coded character assassination. When white players like Gascoigne or Waddle were inconsistent, they were called mercurial or mavericks. When Barnes was inconsistent, he was lazy or uninterested. When white players had a calm demeanour, they were composed or ice cold. When Barnes was calm, he lacked passion or was arrogant. When white players struggled internationally, the system did not suit them. When Barnes struggled, he did not play for the shirt. The media rewrote Barnes, turning generational talent into a question mark. This narrative had consequences. It shortened his international career, poisoned his relationship with England fans, and created a preconception of laziness that dogged his managerial aspirations. The journalists who propagated this trope, some of whom are now senior pundits, are among those Barnes views with deep scepticism. He argues they shaped the narrative of the lazy black player and denied him credit for his tactical mind. Meanwhile, they praised white players with similar traits using entirely different language. This is the invisible banana skin, the covert racism that persists without overt violence. Barnes is less concerned with the visible racist on the terrace than with the invisible obstructors. The media gatekeepers who shaped narratives, the boardroom decision-makers who deny black managers opportunities, the silent peers who now take the knee but did nothing when it mattered. The unforgiven are those who perpetuate the system of exclusion whilst claiming to be part of the solution. Barnes is a fierce critic of the Kick It Out campaign. He views it as institutional hypocrisy. The movement focuses on visible racism, like fans chanting, whilst ignoring invisible racism in the boardroom and media. He refuses to forgive the establishment for using black players as promotional props, whilst denying them power. His refusal to wear the t-shirts or participate in performative gestures is protest against superficiality. The media narrator is unforgiven. The final category comprises club chairmen and owners who perpetuated the managerial ceiling. Barnes frequently cites his career alongside Paul Ince as evidence of systemic exclusion. Both were legends, yet both were discarded after brief, difficult managerial stints and never allowed to return to the elite level. Barnes argues, black managers are often hired in glass cliff scenarios, situations where failure is likely. Ince at Blackburn, Barnes at Celtic. Then they are judged disproportionately harshly when they fail. White managers are hired, fired, and rehired regardless of track record. This is the merry-go-round Barnes references. The warrior stereotype plays into this. Black players are praised for physical attributes like pace, power, and strength, but they are denied intellectual attributes like tactical nuance, leadership, and management potential. This unconscious bias means when a black manager fails, it confirms intellectual lack. When a white manager fails, it is bad luck. This denial of intellectual respect is the ultimate unforgivable sin. The institutional gatekeeper represents the invisible banana skin that ensures the boardroom remains white even as the pitch becomes black. The system is unforgiven. Barnes's unforgiveness is ultimately sociological. He explicitly links racism to capitalism. He argues that as long as capitalism requires an underclass to exploit, racism will exist as a tool to justify exploitation. He forgives the working-class racist fan because he views them as victims of the same conditioning. But he does not forgive the five players, the powerful, the educated, the influential who benefit from the system. He reserves his anger for Mark Viduka, who used power to undermine, Glenn Hoddle, who used philosophy to exclude, the silent teammates, who used privilege to ignore, the media narrator, who stole identity and turned calm into careless, and the institutional gatekeeper, who keeps the boardroom white. These are not petty grudges. They are a scathing indictment of a culture. Barnes's unforgiveness is not bitterness, it is memory. In refusing to forgive the silence of the past, he forces the present to speak. He stands as witness to the fact that whilst the bananas have been swept away, the silence remains. In the dressing rooms, in the boardrooms, in the press boxes, the silence is deafening. Mark Viduka represents the refusal of the white subordinate to accept black authority, a mutiny that cost Barnes his managerial career. Glenn Hoddle represents the intellectual arrogance of an establishment that could not accommodate black genius on its own terms. The silent teammate represents the passive complicity of the white majority who prioritized comfort over justice. The media narrator represents the theft of identity, and the institutional gatekeeper represents the invisible banana skin. The pattern repeats itself today. Black managers are still hired into impossible situations. They are still judged more harshly when they fail. They are still denied the second and third chances that white managers receive as standard. The language has changed. Nobody throws bananas anymore, but the structure remains. The boardrooms are still predominantly white. The media still codes language differently for black players and managers. The pathway to top jobs is still blocked by invisible barriers. Barnes sees through the performative anti-racism. He knows that taking the knee means nothing if the system stays intact. That is why he refuses to play along. That is why he names names. That is why he will not forgive, because forgiveness without accountability is complicity. Every time a black manager is appointed to a struggling club and given 6 months to turn it around, Barnes sees Viduka refusing to play. Every time a pundit questions whether a black manager has the tactical intelligence for the job, Barnes hears Hoddle's philosophy of exclusion. Every time colleagues stay quiet when racism occurs, Barnes feels the silence of that Liverpool dressing room. Every time someone says football has moved on, Barnes points to the statistics. How many black managers in the Premier League right now? How many in the Championship? How many black executives in boardrooms? The numbers tell the truth that the slogans hide. Progress is not real if the power structure remains unchanged. Barnes is one of the greats. 2 Footballer of the Year awards, 2 league titles, 79 England caps. A player who redefined what was possible on the pitch, yet he was never protected like one. He was left to face the abuse alone. His teammates laughed or stayed silent. Viduka refused to play. Hoddle marginalised him. The media rewrote him, and the boardrooms locked him out. This is not about 5 individual players. Thus is about a system, a culture, a betrayal, and Barnes will never forget.